India's Modi government has issued its strongest worded counter ever to the CCP, terming China's actions ludicrous and unacceptable. This after an 18-hour torture of an Indian woman from Arunachal Pradesh at Shanghai airport and CCP's laughable claim that the Indian state of Arunachal is part of China. Thank God the CCP has not claimed the moon as Chinese territory yet. According to Oxford Learner's Dictionary, ludicrous means something that cannot be taken seriously. Cambridge Dictionary states ludicrous as something stupid and deserves to be laughed at. China's ludicrous claims over its neighbors' territories has become a laughingstock in the international stage. CCP doesn't recognize India's Arunachal. It doesn't recognize Japan's Senkaku Islands, nor Doklam in Bhutan, nor does it recognize Taiwan. China does not recognize the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines or Vietnam or Indonesia or Malaysia. Maybe it's time for the world to unite now and stop recognizing the ludicrous One China policy. Maybe it's time to correct the historical blunder of the Nehru government of 1954 and end the recognition of ancient nation of Tibet as part of China. Multiple maps of the real China are now doing the rounds on social media. So what is the India-China-Tibet-Arunachal dispute? Why has the world stood silent on China's occupation of Tibet? And what are the BJP and Congress saying on Arunachal women's torture in China? We'll get you all the latest details, so stay with us. But first, if you search the term India-US tariffs, then you will see how Google News Videos has ranked our story as the #1 report on this topic. So if you want the most informative content on geopolitics, defense or economy, do remember to subscribe to Inconnect News if you haven't done already. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs has hit back at China after a woman from Arunachal Pradesh was illegally detained at Shanghai airport, and then the CCP had the audacity to claim Arunachal Pradesh as Chinese territory. Tawang in Arunachal is the same region from where in 2022 visuals emerged of Indian troops beating Chinese soldiers with sticks. The MEA spokesperson Ranveer Jaiswal declared, Arunachal Pradesh is an integral and inalienable part of India, and this is self-evident fact. No amount of denial by the Chinese side is going to change this indisputable reality. Beijing has not explained why a valid Indian citizen was detained. Is traveling to China or via China becoming increasingly risky for international travelers? We'll also tell you how China has a history of detaining international travelers. Ranveer Jaiswal added, the issue of detention has been taken up strongly with the Chinese side. Chinese authorities have still not been able to explain their actions, which are in violation of several conventions governing international air travel. The actions by the Chinese authorities also violate their own regulations that allow visa-free transit up to 24 hours for nationals of all countries. So this raises a direct question. Did China harass this young woman to play the Tibet card? Is China using her as an example to justify its military occupation of Tibet and thus raise questions on Arunachal? The response from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs was rather shocking. CCP claims its authorities acted in accordance with Chinese laws and procedures and that there was no violation on their part.
China does not recognize the so-called Arunachal Pradesh illegally set up by India.
So the CCP believes harassing international tourists is not a violation. CCP forgets that Indians, like the rest of the world, enjoy democracy and do not live in a police state like China, where people have to abandon and give up and surrender their basic human rights. Tawang in Arunachal is the same region from where in 2022 visuals emerged of Indian troops beating Chinese soldiers with sticks. There have been dozens of cases where foreigners traveling to China were suddenly detained. In 2021, a Chinese-Australian TV anchor, Cheng Lei, was detained. In December 2018, 2 Canadian citizens were detained. Canada claims over 11 have been detained in China, while over 200 others faced harassment. 3 US citizens were wrongfully detained between 2012 and 2021. The US, UK and Australian governments have previously issued advisories warning their citizens on risks of arbitrary detentions in China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry added, India has illegally settled Arunachal Pradesh. Pem Wang Thangdok, a citizen of India from Arunachal Pradesh, had revealed how Chinese authorities claimed her passport is not valid and that she should get a Chinese passport. They allegedly laughed at her and mocked her. They denied her food and access to information during her 18-hour ordeal before Indian embassy intervened and ensured her freedom from China's clutches. Congress and the BJP have also jumped in the debate.
Because whole world knows that Arunachal is an integral part of India and their identity is Indian.
The Congress government, which accepted Tibet as part of China in 1954, now demands a strong response from the Modi government to China. Congress stated, "This language of China is extremely objectionable. This is an insult to India. The Modi government should lodge a strong protest to this. Such low-level rhetoric regarding India will not be tolerated," unquote. So the big question is, what is the Tibet-Arunachal dispute? And will that lead to a war between nuclear powers, India and China? As Arunachal Pradesh Chief Minister Pema Khandu had stated earlier, the fact is that throughout thousands of years of history, India shared its border with Tibet and never with China. All that changed in 1950 and the Chinese military occupation of Tibet, while the world stood by and watched, exhausted by World War II. The annexation of Tibet by China is the root of all tensions along the 3,440-kilometer-long border, which also includes Arunachal Pradesh's border with Tibet. Thousands of Tibetan refugees had fled to India in the 1950s along with Tibetan spiritual leader the Dalai Lama as they refused to live under Chinese military rule. Reports indicate that over 100,000 Tibetans may still be living in India away from their homeland. The main dispute involves the 1914 McMahon Line. The Shimla Conference was held in 1914 with all parties present, which included India, Tibet, China, and the British, who were mediating the agreement. The negotiations led to the establishment of the McMahon Line, or the border according to which Arunachal Pradesh was recognized historically as Indian territory and not Tibetan land. Even the Tibetans agreed to this. But China never accepted this, even though it was not a direct party. China claims Tibet had no authority or the sovereignty to consent to this agreement. After 1947 and India's independence, Indian governments recognized and respected this McMahon Line. But when China captured Tibet in 1950s, it immediately turned its attention and gaze to Arunachal Pradesh as well as Ladakh. Tensions over the boundary line culminated in the Sino-India War in 1962 when Chinese forces launched an all-out offensive on the 20th of October. They led an incursion into Indian territory northeast frontier, especially in Arunachal. Chinese troops withdrew, however, when the Indian army amassed its own troops, and a ceasefire finally put an end to this war. However, China still maintained that Arunachal was South Tibet. After 1962, LAC had become the de facto ceasefire line, even though China had captured and occupied 38,000 square kilometers of land in Ladakh, known as the Aksai Chin region. Till today, Arunachal Pradesh remains a major region of confrontation. Since 2017, China has released multiple lists with imaginary names for places in Arunachal. The first list had 6 names, the second list in 2021 had 15 names, and the third in 2023 had 11 names. India retaliated in 2024 by restoring 30 ancient names of places in Tibet which existed before the Chinese occupation. Today, not just the United States, but the world recognizes Arunachal Pradesh as an integral and inalienable part of Indian territory. So Arunachal is Indian, but what about Tibet? Is China's military occupation of Tibet illegal? Tibet was a sovereign country until the Chinese army invaded and annexed the region in 1950s. Here's a quick timeline. Tibet was a region which had maintained de facto independence for thousands of years of its history. Tibet had its own indigenous people, it had its own language, its own military and its own currency. What else constitutes a nation? It had declared its independence from China and had been flourishing for decades, but That changed in the 1950s. Chinese troops crossed the Jinsha River and invaded eastern part of Tibet on 7th of October. By 19th of October, Chinese troops had already captured towns of Chambo. Hundreds of Tibetan soldiers had lost their lives in these clashes, and more than 3,000 were taken prisoner by the Chinese. After Chambo, China put immense pressure on the then Tibetan government to hold negotiations. In 1951 then, the 17-point agreement was signed between them. Under this, Tibet was placed under Chinese rule, and it also gave full access to the PLA to establish their presence in the region. In fact, Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, formally ratified this agreement on 24th of October 1951, but historical accounts and his own admission later stated that he was forced and threatened by the Chinese to sign this agreement. Even after the agreement was signed, the Tibetans continued to resist Chinese authority, leading to an uprising in Lhasa in 1959, which was crushed brutally. Thousands of Tibetans lost their lives in the Lhasa uprising when the Chinese crushed it. Many monasteries were destroyed. The Dalai Lama escaped and sought refuge in India and never returned to live under Chinese occupation again. Tibet was then fully annexed by China. Then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru granted safe refuge to Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetan refugees. In fact, the Dalai Lama crossed into India through the Kenzimane Pass in Arunachal Pradesh and was granted political asylum by Nehru in 1959. However, the damage had been done, as the Nehru government had already committed the blunder of accepting Chinese rule over Tibet a few years ago in 1954. India and Tibet's relations are rooted in Hinduism, Buddhism, trade and pilgrimage. Buddhism originated in India, also spread to Tibet and then to China in the 6th century AD, shaping their spiritual and cultural identity. Indian Hindu religion's most sacred site, the Kailash Mansarovar, is situated in Tibet. Indian scholars like Padma Shambhava and Shantarakshita also influenced the region and its people. They established monasteries and laid the foundation for Tibetan Buddhism. For centuries, India and Tibet had traded through Kalimpong, Lipulek and Gartangali routes to exchange goods like spices, textiles, wool, salt, along with the exchange of ideas, art, culture and religious practices. The Dalai Lama continues to support Tibetan autonomy and rejects Beijing's attempts to control Tibetan Buddhist leadership. Dalai Lama also spoke before his 90th birthday via a recorded video message and stated, "I am affirming that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue. No one else has any such authority to interfere in this manner." Tencho Gyatso, president of the International Campaign for Tibet, stated, "The Dalai Lama's statement is a robust assertion of something we have known all along, namely, that is the sole right of the Tibetan people and the Tibetan Buddhist community to recognize the next Dalai Lama. However, it is absolutely vital that any attempt by China to interfere in the future of the Dalai Lama institution is firmly rejected." Unquote. Tibetans have long accused the CCP of trying to eradicate their culture, history and identity. Multiple reports like this one by the Human Rights Watch highlight hundreds of detentions of Tibetans by the CCP while increasing Chinese control over daily life of Tibetans. Another shocking report by the United Nations highlights how the CCP has separated 1 million Tibetan children from their families in an attempt to eradicate Tibetan culture and Tibetan future. China's territorial dispute is not just with India and Tibet, but with 17 other nations around its neighborhood. China's dispute with Nepal is around the same lines as Arunachal. CCP claims Nepalese some regions belong to Tibet and thus to China. China in fact captured Rui village in Nepal in 2020. CCP also claims that a large part of eastern Bhutan, which includes areas like Do, Cherkip and others, are part of China. China also had border dispute with Bhutan in 1986 and then again during the Doklam standoff. China also claims to own parts of Laos. Apparently, the claims go back to the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century. China and Mongolia have also faced territorial and border disputes. In fact, Mongols occupied large parts of China for over a century. The Chinese built the Great Wall in the 14th century to mark the border between Mongolia and China. Today, China has occupied much of ancient Mongolia, and the Great Wall lies well inside modern Chinese borders. According to an agreement signed in 1960, China and Myanmar share a 2,185-kilometer-long border, but in 2020, Myanmar accused China of border conflicts and inciting terror groups. CCP claims rights over the country of Taiwan. In fact, the Chinese military has openly simulated war games on a possible invasion of Taiwan. CCP has also maritime disputes with ASEAN nations over Paracel Islands, Scarborough Shoal, Spratly Islands, and Macclesfield Bank. Chinese and the Philippines navies have in fact come to blows. The Chinese Coast Guard used axes and knives when the Philippines rejected and protested Chinese entry into Manila's EEZ around Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Islands. The Philippines maintains its maritime rights and the EEZ is non-negotiable. The Spratly Islands are a major region of contention as even Malaysia and Vietnam are protesting Chinese aggression. In fact, Vietnam and China had a naval clash over Spratly Islands in 1988. Indonesia and China have had conflicts over Natuna Islands and CCP's imaginary and illegal 9-dash line. China also rejects Japanese ownership of the Senkaku Islands near Taiwan, and tensions continue between the two historically hostile neighbors. But what do you believe? Should all these nations now unite and reject the so-called One China policy? And is it time for world powers to grow a spine and support the cause of the Tibetan people? Leave a comment with your opinion, like and subscribe to Inconnect News.